So let me briefly, everybody knows who Kino is or they wouldn't be here tonight, but Kino Satoshi is truly one of the great rising stars on the ceramic stage today. He has won since there you see his biography there. This was just literally updated a few days ago because he has won yet another award, the special prize from the Taiwan International Ceramics Biennale. And he's had other works entering the collections of museums in Europe, in Taiwan, in Japan, and of course, the United States. So we are here to hear from him himself, as well as to hear tonight from all our participants, just what is it about Kino Satoshi that captures your attention, that sets him apart from all these other artists who are brilliant craftsmen in the world of contemporary clay, and what sets his oeuvre on a level that could be transcendent of what's come before. So my first question is to Rob Mintz. Rob, recently the Asian Art Museum received a gift of one of Kino-san's Oroshi series and displayed it in the gallery. What kind of reactions did you see among the visitors who encountered this masterwork? And why do you think the public is so predisposed to like Japanese sculptural work as opposed to functional work?
Great question. Thanks, Joan. And hi, everybody. It's so nice to see people who I know who are locals here in San Francisco, and then also people from New York and from Japan and from everywhere in between, and New Orleans. Hi, Lisa. It's really, this is kind of a wonderful thing. And when Joan asked, would we participate? I found myself thinking, do what? Another meeting? It's just like work. This isn't like work. This is like a party. Which is fabulous. So, but to your question, I think, it was interesting to watch people galleries and see this work because they are accustomed, I think, to thinking of clay, be it contemporary clay or traditional clay, as the material, as you said, for functional items, for conventional vessels and forms that are very familiar. And here was something that was gravity defying, that was intriguing, that seemed sort of organic, but really not organic. And it seems, I saw people move close and then far, and then to try to understand the dimensionality of the piece in space. And I think it was evidence of their understanding a kind of fundamental tension that exists in these works, that gravity is pulling on them and yet they defy gravity and they reach up into the air. And at the same time, it appears to be two-dimensional, it appears to be three-dimensional, it defines space, and yet that space is empty space. So I think, it drew people in a very interesting way that many works, particularly abstract works in the collection, don't. And so I think it was a hit. It was certainly a popular work and one that left people thinking, wow, what's coming next?
Wonderful. Tracy, do you have my microphone on? I don't know.
Yes, you are.
Okay. I have one more question for Rob before I move on to Lisa. How would you compare, Rob, because you're so familiar with the whole array of contemporary Japanese clay, the work of the Kyoto-based Kino to the work of his senior Fukami Sueharu? Or perhaps Yagi Akira too.
Yeah. I think, so when I first saw Kino-san's work, I did think about Fukami-san, and I did think about the traditions of these, pale celadon glazed porcelains. But I think very quickly you see that something fundamentally different is happening with these works. Fukami-san's work was ground blazing and continues to be just wonderful and exciting, and yet I think Kino-san is really moving in a direction that's much more intimate, that's much more personal. The scale, in part, being sort of tangible scale, hand scale, makes it somehow just a little bit more sensitive, more tender. I think Fukami-san's work in many cases makes me think, ooh, you know, it's a little threatening. It's big, it's bold, it's dramatic. And that works for audiences, you know, around the world. But works like this really pull you in and demand of you a kind of one-on-one exchange. And, you know, I think in that lies something of, at least what I appreciate about Kino-san's work, is really that ability to make a personal connection that maybe his predecessors, perhaps it wasn't even a concern of theirs, that they were blazing different ground. So.
That's really interesting, Rob. You will find that as the evening progresses, we're going to learn about works that are larger than 3 feet broad.
That's going to make them less personal.
Yeah. So we shall put this in a context as we proceed. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Lisa, in your case at New Orleans Museum of Art, how do you find that the public reacted somewhat differently than how Rob experienced it in San Francisco?
Well, to some degree. So our audience is obviously different. So we fall within the encyclopedic art museum, segment. And so our visitors have very different points of entry into the world of Asian art and certainly to Japanese ceramics. And we display contemporary and modern ceramics within our Japanese galleries and have done so for probably 20 years. But they're not so familiar with the range of what contemporary artists are creating. So Kino-san's work was really a revelation, I think, for many of our visitors. And we do have a very clay conversant community. We have a long tradition of a ceramic creation in New Orleans and in the South. So there are many, many potters who come. And for them, it was fascinating to talk to them in the galleries. They viewed this almost as a deconstructed vessel. They understood it as ceramic, but they looked at it as part of a whole, in a way. And they were really struck by the tension, as Rob was pointing out, of the materiality of the object. Because of course, as we all know, they're heavy. They're very heavy and they're very robust objects, but they look so ephemeral. They look so light and like a brushstroke, really. And that was one of the things that, for us, we are able to show ceramics in immediate proximity to paintings. And so many of our visitors see this as sort of a brushstroke made visible or manifest in clay.
I love your comment, Lisa, because it reminds me, I saw the exhibition and that was wonderful. And there are a couple of shots I took and then we used for my book Allure, where you were juxtaposing ceramics against beautiful Zen Buddhist calligraphy.
Right.
And it was perfect, absolutely perfect. So I agree with you completely. Might I say, with that show, with the Gitter show, New Forms and New Voices, could you speak to how you chose to take Kino's works and place them within the context of that exhibition? I was there, I remember it very well, but I suspect that the majority of people who are seated here today don't know how you chose to display them.
Well, it was for us the opportunity to show this work in the New Forms, New Voices, and I think I should start really with the catalog, because it was the catalog cover that really pointed the direction and gave visitors a sense of what they should expect from the show. It was going to be full of great works by wonderful artists, many who were, recognizable, certainly to the people participating tonight and highly revered, but also to those who had no experience with Japanese ceramics. It was a great point of entry into the field. And so to place the works, we obviously put them with other Celadon works in this particular instance. But once the work was gifted to the museum by Alice and Kurt after the close of the exhibition, this sculpture has never been off view. It's been in the galleries for the last several years because it relates to everything. It relates to every object that we have, whether they were created 200 years before, or 400 years before, or are contemporary. So it really was about contrast, in a sense. Many of the works in the Gitter-Yellen collection are vessels. Of course, there are sculptural works and abstract works, but many of them were vessels. And this sculpture was placed in juxtaposition with more traditionally formed objects. And so I think it just shone in its location.
That's so exciting to hear, and I can't wait to when Kino-san joins us to hear his reaction to your comments. I can't wait. I wish I could see his face now. I mean, I'm Jewish, and he should be melting with joy to hear he should be. Velling is the word.
we're melting with joy to have it in our collection, and we're very grateful to Kurt and Alice for it.
Thank you, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
Carol Conover. I say Carol Conover because we got two Carols here. Carol, how did you first encounter the work of Kino Satoshi? Where did you find him?
I first saw Kino's work at your gallery, Joan, in the fall of 2017. And I would say it was absolutely love at first sight for me. And I have never bought a Japanese ceramic in my life. I'm a Chinese ceramic person. I'm a specialist. I collect Chinese ceramics, but I'm not an impulse buyer, but I was for this piece, the piece that I bought. I absolutely just completely fell in love.
So Carol, you fell in love. So what about his work do you feel, with your substantial expertise in things Celadon and your grounding in the world of clay, profoundly from Asia, spanning, I guess, about 5,000 years. What about Kino Satoshi's work captivated you? What was it?
Well, at first, I was thinking it sort of looks like Yingqing ware. But what really does it for me is that one of my most favorite kinds of ceramics is ceramics, monochromes made in the Yongjung period, and especially Celadons. It's like around 1730. And the color of those Celadons, it's a very short period in China. This work reminded me of that, because it's extremely fine. It doesn't, like the earlier period is a very different color. The next period is very finicky, but this is a very, very subtle color. And it's not so much the Yingqing ware of the Song Dynasty as much as the Qing monochrome for me.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Carol. Alan Beller, you're there, I hope. So Alan, as a fan—
I am here.
Yeah, okay. As a fan of Japanese clay art for decades, together with Leslie in the early days, what was it? Because I think the first piece that we're looking at now on the screen is your first acquisition, and this gives everybody some idea of where Kino Satoshi's work started when I first found him and where he is today. So what was it about this work that captivated you and Leslie and made you make the plunge?
Well, I had seen actually not Japanese, but Korean and Chinese Celadon work when we were living in Asia. And Joan, as you may remember, I think the very first piece I bought was of Japanese ceramics, was a Seihakuji glazed piece that was pretty conventional in shape. You can actually see it over my shoulder, by Kawase. And most of what we and I collected early, I became enamored with textures and shapes more than with the Celadon Seihakuji glaze. And then, and I actually kind of remember, I saw this piece in 2016 in one of your shows, and you've got lots of experts on your screen today. I am not an expert. I'm a fan, and I know what I like. And I was struck by how this, the glaze that I had seen before with other artists, but had seen, and by the way, Suihara was one of them. Joan, you may remember this. My daughter was a student assistant and then an assistant curator for Willard Clark out in California, and she co-curated a Suihara show, Fukami Suihara show, and I met him that night at the opening. But this piece and Kino-san's work grabbed me because, in addition to it made me look at the finish again because of the combination of what I think is the dynamism, which is so unusual with a finish like this, and the fact that you could really not hold it, but appreciate it as kind of a very, and this harkens back to something that has been said earlier in this conversation. It's kind of a personal, intimate piece of sculpture, and it struck me that way, and so we took it home. And I must say, as I've got, and you would know because you know most of what I have acquired, my interest in texture and glaze has become greater more recently, and my interest in sort of more out there stoneware. I still love it, but it's balanced by an appreciation of the other. So that's how I got here.
Okay. Got it. And I agree with you. And that's pretty good analysis of the evolution of your sensibilities. Perfect. Jeffrey and Carol, what about Kino Satoshi's work exemplifies your goals in collecting contemporary display?
A collection that is gigantic in scale, about 1,500 objects that have been used across 30 U.S. museums. So part of the collection, Matt, is a relatively complete story of Japanese ceramics from 1950 to yesterday. But another part of that that's very important to us is the identification of potential significant younger artists who are very active now, either early career or mid-career, that will become part of the great canon of this tradition of modern contemporary ceramics. So his work certainly is interesting. It was, when we first saw it, it was new, it was fresh, but it still connected, as we like to have, with traditional aspects, at least in part. So the celadon treatment, of course, is that way. And his work is both sculptural, which is very interesting. There's a tradition in Western sculpture and probably globally, ribbon-like sculpture. Most of it is relatively perfunctory. His was not. His rose to the level of art out of what is often just mere decoration with this ribbon-type form. It also showed the promise of relating to two of the more important 20th century, most important 20th century sculptors, David Smith and Anthony Caro, American and English respectively, who in part of their career format they were using miniature as a type of three-dimensional drawing. And we could see even in the early work that is probably where this would go. And in fact, that is where it went.
For someone who doesn't own a Kino Satoshi's work, what advice could you give them if they're considering?
Well, having written about the art market, given lectures about the art market, and having been an art dealer in my misspent youth in Los Angeles in the 1970s, there is very little in the art market in total that is not really expensive now. Here, you get something innovative, controlled, with an expertise on the technical side and the side, for basically not so much money that collectors at different price points cannot afford to buy this. It also works really well in a home. You can put it in the middle of a table, meaning use it as a three-dimensional object, or you can put it on a shelf display or a platform against a wall as more of a two-dimensional object.
Okay, wonderful. So Rob, can I ask you first to ask your question of Kino that you've thought about?
Kino-san, I'm curious to know, with regard to the celadon glaze that you use and its long history in China and then across East Asia, what kinds of historical ideas are you expecting us as viewers to bring to the piece? What kinds of little cues to the past do you hope to bring forward?
中国の美しい作品という役からインスピレーションを受けた詩っていうのはたくさんあって、それは言葉にしている時に作品以上にどういう色かというのを深く想像させてくれると思ってます。で、中国から始まった静白寺ですけども、日本でさらにそれを発展していって長い歴史としてある、その文脈の中の一つとして、その時代の流れを受け継ぐ一つとして、静白寺の僕の作品を捉えてもらえればと思っています。
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Carol, Conover, do you have a question for Kino-san?
Yes, I know Kino-san has been to Taiwan. Have you been to China?
中国には行ったことがあります。何度か行ったことがあって、静白寺のふるさとの慶徳神社も行ったことありますし、一番長く滞在したいときは1ヶ月ぐらい、西安というところに中国の古い古都ですね、1ヶ月ぐらい滞在してました。
Alan Beller, are you there? Do you have a question for Kino-san?
Yes, I do have a couple, but let me ask one that maybe moves slightly away from what we've been seeing. Kino-san, can you perhaps describe how the your new Choseki pieces, or at least they're new, I think, to the U.S. and certainly to me. How do the Choseki, the tides pieces, relate to your other work?
作品を作るときのルール、自分の中の時期とろくろを使うっていうのは、一つの同じコンセプトを空間に消えていく形というコンセプトで作っていて、そこは定石も卸シリーズも共通しているところです。そして定石シリーズになってからは台湾で新しい工房を作って、その海を見ていて影響されているんですけども、今まで形と色のグラデーションというところで空間に消えていくという状況を作っていたものに対して、定石は色とテクスチャーで空間に消えていく造形というのを目指しています。
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lisa, have you a question for Mr. Kino?
I do indeed. So earlier you mentioned poetry as being a source of inspiration for the idea of color. And I was wondering if there were other arts, perhaps music or other visual arts or artists who have inspired you or who you look toward for inspiration.
陶芸家としての作家ではやはり自分が陶芸家になりたいと思った人は西田淳という作家で、それから作家として活動していく中で、作家の活動のやり方みたいのはイサムの口とかから影響を受けています。でも、やっぱり一番作品に影響しているのはやっぱり自然の風景ですね。自然の壮大な風景とか、そういうものからそういうインスピレーションをたくさん受けていて、いろんな世界の各地を旅行してそういう風景を見ると、すごくいろんな作品を作りたいなと感じることが多いです。
Wonderful. Carol and Jeffrey, I'm sure you have a question or two for Kino-san.
So we have been following the work based from our first purchase for almost 6 years now. One of the things that seems to be happening is a very methodical progression of dealing with one technical issue in pursuit of a more expanded aesthetic range. What would you say is your biggest challenge when you're working with these forms? Is it the form itself? Is it the size, the delicacy of it, the gradation of the glaze? And if you could start all over, what would you do, if anything, that would be different?
やっぱり制作において一番難しいのは磁気を使うということです。磁気は、触るとその形を形を記憶して焼いた時にまた出てくるという性質があって、例えば作る時に強く押すと表面をきれいにならしても焼いた時にまた凹みが出てくるという性質があるので、できるだけ手数を加えない、たくさん触らないということが求められるんですけども、矛盾しているようなんですけども、たくさん触らないっても自分の作りたい形、感情を込めるというところのバランスみたいなところが一番難しいところです。他の素材を作るかということですけども、それについては、今もやっぱり陶芸だけではなくて他の素材も意識的に触るようにしていて、最近では石の彫刻なども挑戦して、それを陶芸の制作に何かしらの影響を与えたらいいなというふうに思っています。
So everyone, as you're looking at this new Vortex series, I think it's really important to get a sense of scale. This piece you're looking at, I believe, is 3.5 feet. So just try to imagine this thin ribbon-like piece of porcelain with these curves extending wider than your arm span. To get this to successfully fire without cracking and then glaze, and how do you glaze it? Because his other works would rest on a side and they would be flat on one side. There's no flat side here. This is a whole step ahead of what he's been doing to date that is, I think, transcendent and bringing him to a whole new level from what our previous show of his work was about just a few years ago.